is shown here, and we could look to the next page, showed, and this is for fecal coliform, showed no significant relationship between them at all. And in fact, you can see the downward sloping line there for highly credible GI symptoms. It was actually negative. But the same study, and if we could go to the next slide, please, did show that there was another indicator bacteria, E. coli, which did have a very significant association with swimmer disease. This is statistically significant, and if we could go to the next slide, please. The report said that fecal coliform is just has low value in the correlation coefficient, and the slopes are flat. And you can see in the table below, E. coli correlation coefficient very robust, fecal coliform either weak and NS, and not significant, statistically significant, or negative. And in fact, fecal coliform, as you all know, was strongly recommended by the EPA back in '86 to be discarded and replaced by E. coli. The hypothesis that was proposed in 1951 was disproven, and the EPA in '86 strongly recommended abandoning fecal coliform. It took a while for numerical standards for E. coli to be promulgated. That was finally done by the EPA, as I'm sure you know, in 2012. And yet, on this recommendation of preserving the listing based solely on fecal coliform, the North Coast Board is trying to preserve that standard for one more review cycle. They have already said that they're going to eliminate it between this cycle and the next. Their TMDL, which they're proposing, discards any reference to fecal coliform, and we're therefore left with a very surprising result that against 8 lines of positive E. coli evidence, a single line of fecal coliform evidence is the sole support for a TMDL that ignores fecal coliform altogether.
Since you're here, and we also have the regional board here, let's hear from the regional board.
Hello again, Rebecca Fitzgerald from the North Coast Board. Mr. Deemer is correct that we are becoming less reliant on fecal coliform and more reliant on E. coli as a preferred indicator of fecal contamination in water, especially as we develop our Russian River pathogen TMDL. When we were looking at the data for this cycle, we also considered, well, we basically came down to the consideration of what does our bacteria objective state, and do we have evidence that that is being attained or not. Our bacteria objective is in 3 parts. One part is in regards to recreation, and it kind of is based on that historic fecal coliform number and recreational use support and epidemiological study, and we prefer to use E. coli there going forward to determine if there is any risk for water contact recreation. The second part of our objective deals with natural background and is a narrative that says that our natural background levels shall not be, basically shall not be exceeded. And it is on this that we decided to not delist the Russian River for bacteria. We have evidence from data we've collected as part of the TMDL that shows human waste from DNA analysis and also from Bacteroides bacteria. And it was on that evidence that we felt that there was enough justification of exceedance of our objective, and so we wanted to keep the river listed as impaired. That said, we are doing a TMDL for pathogens, for indicator bacteria. That will give us, that will really be the opportunity for us to lay out the extent of impairment throughout the watershed, and of course what we hope to do in order to rectify it.
And are you working with Mr. Deemer on this issue?
Yes, we've had several conversations actually about the TMDL with him and other residents and other stakeholders.
If I could just make one concluding comment. My concern here is not to eliminate this TMDL. There's plenty of situations in the Russian River Basin, redwood boxes, cesspools, failing septic systems that need to be remedied. But my concern is that this continued listing will push Tier 0 systems like ours that are regularly inspected, properly functioning, up to Tier 3. And that will impose costs of about $50,000 or more for alternative systems or sewer hookups. And I hope that that situation will be taken into account in the decision. And I hope we heard that, in fact, the recommendation not to delist was based on things that, frankly, are not part of the 303D criteria. And I hope that this board can send the decision back to the North Coast Board, or at least back to its own staff, for a consideration of why E. coli, the fecal coliform hypothesis, disproven as it is, and it's not 8-1, it's 8-0, because fecal coliform has been affirmatively disproven, as to why this should be the basis for moving properly functioning Tier 0 systems up to Tier 3. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now Linda and everyone else that's supposed to be speaking should be sitting on the front row. And I don't see but 3 people on the front row, and none of them are the speakers.
They're very quick walkers.
No. We've already seen that. Linda, go ahead. Linda
Thank
Sheehan.
you. Thank you, Linda Sheehan with Earth Law Center, and I'm also speaking today on behalf of the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance. It's been 5 years of working to stand before you today, and I welcome this opportunity to talk with you about flow impairments in the North Coast. The staff report says that we shouldn't be listing these flow impairments on our impaired water bodies list or in the integrated report, and we respectfully disagree. In fact, at least 10 other states, as we've mentioned, list flow impaired waters on either the 303D list or the 305B list. And that includes western states like Montana, Idaho, Washington, Wyoming, et cetera. Half of those list on the 303D list whether or not there are other impairing pollutants present. And the other half list on the 305B list because they want to reserve the 303D list just for TMDLs. We particularly like Tennessee's approach. They say that the public likes to use the 303D list as a way to check on what's impaired and what's not. And so they need to be comprehensive and include flows as a result. The 303D lists that do include flow impairments, of course, are approved by EPA, and in some areas of the country, US EPA is pushing and supporting quite heavily this idea of the Clean Water Act applied to flows. So we're asking you, and you'll hear more today about this listing, we're asking you to list California's impaired waterways as impaired by low flows in Northern California for at least 5 reasons, and I'll summarize those quickly. First, the ones that we're talking about today are not drought issues. These are systemic problems. They've been impaired for many years. As I mentioned, we put in this data 5 years ago, and these problems are continuing. So we need to recognize that and act on it now. Second, with flow listings, the state has a better idea of what their top priorities are. We know what the real problem is, and so we can spend money more effectively. Third, listing can help fast-track funding, like Proposition 1 funding, toward the right waterways. Fourth, listings can help support local land use and planning decisions. For example, CEQA reviews that reflect flow listings can better prevent land uses that worsen waterway status. And then finally, we've created enormous obstacles toward water body health by pretending that we can keep water quality and flow separate. And by recognizing flow impairments through the 303D list, we can start to bridge that gap and recognize waterways holistically. Proposition 1 heavily emphasizes this concept of multiple benefits from state funding and attention. And we need to identify all the stressors that waterways face in order to be able to do that. So the question's been raised to us as well, what benefits are there? Why bother to list? So just a couple of examples from states that are doing this. In Ohio, flow listings are discussed in TMDL reports and watershed assessment reports. They frequently provide the technical arguments for dam removal and alteration, and Ohio has provided Section 319 funding and other funding to communities to modify or take out dams based on flow listings. In Michigan, flow listings result in greater attention to flow-impaired waterways, including more funding. Listings also improve watershed management plans, and they support flow-related BMPs that provide multiple benefits. In New Mexico, flow-listed waterways get a better shot at 319 funding. What does this all mean? It means that the State Water Board can, and it should, appropriately identify North Coast waterways that are flow-impaired on their integrated report or their 303D list. And the North Coast staff report even finds sufficient evidence right now itself to list the Scott and Shasta rivers. There's zero flow in some of these North Coast waterways at critical times of the year for fish spawning. No special analysis is needed when there's zero flow. Zero flow is too little. So in summary, we ask that you list the identified waters as flow impaired, and that it's important to reflect that we need to take this action right now, because a lot of the processes that we're talking about, public trust, et cetera, will take years to make changes. And this is the kind of thing we can use right now, as you'll hear more from with my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Ms. Sheehan, before you leave the podium, I think you had a great deal of involvement in the development at the time as Executive Director of California Coastkeeper Alliance in the development of the listing policy.
Indeed.
Right?
Yeah, and I think that started back at OSHA Conservancy.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, no,
so
and
you've
sped
definitely
over and
yeah. And so, you know, putting aside all the benefits of a potential flow listing, which I can't disagree with, one of the things that really struck me from, you know, staff's presentation and staff's analysis was they're concerned about doing what you recommended without a methodology in place in order to be transparent and to ensure consistency. So as someone who, you know, participated and invested a lot of time and energy in developing the listing policy to help with that transparency and that consistency statewide, I guess I'm curious as to why would that concern also not be applied to flow listing, whether it be part of, you know, the 303D list or as a 4C?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Thank you. And we did discuss that at length in our many AB 982 Public Advisory Group, affectionately known as the PAG meetings. And then that was one of the reasons that we left in a weight of evidence approach, was because we knew just as a general matter there were going to be things that we wouldn't think of. And we wanted to be able to allow staff to be able to make these decisions that we couldn't necessarily rope into a systemic methodology at the time. And so we're seeing now that that issue is coming up. We didn't really think much about flows at the time. It was something that was really quite divorced from water quality. And so now we're starting to see, you know, the nature of that problem reinforcing in front of us, and recognizing the fact that you do need that transparency where there's, you know, uncertainty about, is this flow impaired, is this not flow impaired, I'm not sure. That's why we really tried to focus as a group on waterways that were clearly impaired. And you'll see some photographs today, you've seen them in the past, where, you know, there's zero flow when you need flow for fish to spawn. And that's about as transparent as you get. We use photographs for other TMDLs like trash, et cetera, and so we're not saying rely just on the photographs. North Coast Water Board staff report talked about a methodology that you could use to be able to find the Scott and Shasta data support listings. And so we're saying that there are data out there, and there is additional information that provides, at least for the smallest suite of water bodies, the clarity that we think would be required by the listing policy. And just one other thing is that one of the things that we reinforced in our comments is that ultimately it's the Clean Water Act, right, that is the guiding principle, not our listing policy. And if beneficial uses are impaired, if fish, you know, can't swim on gravel, then it's pretty clear that we need to list, even if our listing policy doesn't quite go A to B to C for that, when it's that clear that we need to list.
And one other question, you mentioned that in other states, EPA, I would assume EPA, other regions, are supportive, or at least have been supportive of these flow listing. Where is EPA Region 9 with respect to this issue?
Well, I mean, I don't know if they're here today, so I don't want to speak for them. I can speak honestly from my conversations with them that they're supportive of this type of listing as well.
EPA did submit a letter, a comment letter in response to the proposed recommendations contained in the staff report, and EPA gave specific recommendations that did serve the basis for some subsequent changes in the staff report and evaluated the proposed list, the 303D list. EPA was completely silent in its letter on the flow issue, notwithstanding the fact that the staff report very clearly identifies that it is a declining listing for purposes of flow at this time.
That's correct.
And it merits mention that EPA has final approval authority over this list, and so one of the opportunities that we have in corresponding with EPA is ascertaining and reading their signals to ensure that our check on the regional boards is in alignment with what we think EPA will ultimately be doing when it adopts its list. Yeah.
Correct.
Thank you. Davis?
Good afternoon, David Keller, Friends of the Eel River. Thank you for holding this hearing and for taking testimony on this. Clearly we have a problem that is falling in institutional cracks at this point, which is you don't have or at least what's being presented to you is you don't have a clear line to be able to list impairment for low flows. And as Linda proposed and other speakers will propose, we think there are, in fact, tracks to get there. The critical thing is time. We don't have time. On the Eel River, we're looking at disconnected segments on a regular basis, both on the main stem and on the South Fork. We do appreciate the work that's being done on Sproul Creek to try and get some of that under control. The marijuana cultivation has added an extremely high bar of concern in trying to get this under control. And given the illegality under federal law, it's difficult. So any tools that you can have, any participation that you and staff can provide is sorely appreciated. Nevertheless, there are some things that are missing from the toolbox at this point, one of which is clear communication with the local planning agencies, with the planning commissions and planning staff on the counties and on major cities that are in waterways in the North Coast. Frequently, I have seen, both as a council member and participant in water related activities, where the county planning commission planning staff do not consider the status of the waterways prior to decision making on whether to move through with SEQR approvals, project approvals. That is left in the hands of the regional board until after the project is approved. There's no information on the table that is accurate and current as to the status of any of the particular waterways, whether they're impaired, whether they're over appropriated, whether there are issues of concern, whether there are water rights that are actually held by the applicant, by the project applicant, whether or not they've been verified. There's a huge amount of information that's just missing in that transaction. So constantly we see applications for projects approved and then kicked to the regional board, and at that point the regional board is left with an approved project pending whatever they come up with. The political pressure on the regional board to approve the project and come up with something that looks like it's right on paper is then substantial. That is not working. It's not working for a number of our water, for our tribs, for our main stem, and certainly not working for groundwater basins as well. So if there was a process that was put in place where on a regular basis there was a clear communication to the local planning agencies of the status of on a particular project or on a particular reach, that would be very helpful. Certainly in terms of establishing best management practices, that would be critical, and having that incorporated within project approval. Finally, this is really the timeline on this is we're looking at a loss of public trust resources, and we don't have time for the preparation and vetting of a new methodology to put low flow in place as an impairment. Certainly you can look at the beer can test.
Okay, that's enough.
That one
Thank
works
you.
out very nicely.
Unless you're offering us a beer, you can't do it.
If the riffle is deeper than a beer can, you got enough room for fish. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Tom, I would appreciate it if you would review just briefly what kinds of actual work we're doing with Fish and Wildlife on setting in-stream flow numbers and on which streams?
Well, let me think for a minute. We certainly have,
This is a test.
Well, yes. Obviously, we've been working on delta issues for a while, and that's been taking up a lot of our time and energy. The 3 tributaries on the San Joaquin River have been the focus of a lot of energy. The Tuolumne, the Merced, and the Stanislaus. Working with Fish and Wildlife, we recently have set some flow objectives for protection of spring run in these drought conditions on Mill, Deer, and Butte Creek. We've been encouraging the regional boards to get engaged in this, and the regional board recently had a workshop and has been directing their staff to look at the Navarro River as a Region 1. They recently held a workshop on this and directed their staff to work on the Navarro River. We've been working with the administration, and we were fortunate enough to have legislation put into, well, first off, we've got it appeared in the governor's action plan that we needed to work on institutionalizing setting public trust flows as part of the board's basic work, and working with Fish and Wildlife, and that called for us to set flows on 5 tributaries over the next few years. We recently, in the drought legislation, the resources necessary to do that work were allocated from the general fund to both Department of Fish and Wildlife and to us. We got 10 positions, and Fish and Wildlife got 12, I believe, plus some contract resources. And we made a commitment in the BCP to work on 5 tributaries: Mill, Shasta, the East Fork of the Eel River, South Fork of the Eel River, I'm sorry, and Ventura and Mark West Creek. We've recently been in communication with Department of Fish and Wildlife about some drought issues in the Russian River watershed, and they will be contacting folks in the Russian River soon to ask them to put together some flow, to do some conservation measures to try to deal with some of the flow issues there. In phase 4 of our Bay Delta proceeding, we've been trying to identify all the tributaries in the Delta watershed that would benefit from flow objectives, and we have a group right now establishing, working on flows for Battle Creek, and should be the first one that we get out. That one was considered important because it's actually one that's in reasonably good shape, migratory corridor shape, and we wanted to preserve those flows before they were diverted at some future date. And also there's, of course, a major hatchery there as well that's necessary to ensure we have passage on that. But we're also looking at all the other tributaries throughout the Delta watershed to see which ones would benefit from additional flow concerns. We also have, of course, our FERC office, which sets flows below watersheds that have dams that have a FERC project on them. And we recently adopted flows for the Feather River. I signed one today for the North Fork Feather River to set flows in some of the tributaries that are being operated there by PG&E. And like I said, I think we'll have some other tributaries in both the Sacramento Basin and San Joaquin Basin that we've been looking at. I also had redirected a number of people in the water rights program to a public trust section, which is now being augmented by the 10 that we just received. So there's a lot of activity going on. I wish I could say we'd actually crossed the finish line on a lot of this, but I can't say that's the case. But I would say that we've got a lot of projects that we have started and are pushing forward. And certainly the phase 1, for example, should be out this summer. And I hope to see this accelerate. The intent was for us to try to institutionalize this function here at the board, since it really was one that we had sort of done on an ad hoc basis historically, we've set flows on the Yuba and the McCullumney, but those were due to complaints by Department of Fish and Wildlife, and we had no program per se to set public trust flows. And I would proud to say that I think we do have a program now, and people who are dedicated to it full time, quite a few people, and I expect to see it being operated in a more robust fashion going into the future.
So I was curious about this as well, and I just pulled up, it's outdated, but still it seems to be quite useful, especially in terms of listing the priority areas. December 2010 report, in-stream flow studies for the protection of public trust resources, a prioritized schedule and estimate of costs. So some of you were probably here for that. But it might be helpful to get an update on that. I don't know. Obviously, listing all these systems and cost after a 5-year period, costs have probably changed. Maybe priorities have changed as well. They're according to category, but not priority within each category from the way I read this. Do you have any other comments?
No, at that time, that was required under the Delta legislation. We were required to put together a list of priority tributaries that would benefit from setting of flow objectives. And I forget the exact number, but we identified over 120 watersheds that would benefit from that. And all of them, of course, the reason that they would benefit is that there are diversions on those watersheds that are diverting flows for purposes of economic development, et cetera. And so we wanted to be sure that there were balanced. And so we still are aware of that. We do refer to that, and that is part of what we consider as we put together the workload from the public trust flows. And, oh, by the way, I guess I forgot to mention too that we have been working recently on putting together what we consider to be a scientifically valid methodology for setting flow objectives on a bigger than stream reach by stream reach basis. The way it's been done historically, in many cases, is basically riffle by riffle. You go through and determine what are the flows necessary for migration across that riffle. But these methods are meant to be ones that can be applied and distributed throughout single or multiple watersheds so that you can do the work in a little more reasonable fashion. And that work will be coming to the board this fall. We're getting it, it's going to be peer reviewed this summer, and hopefully we'll be using that method and encouraging the regional boards to use that method as well in setting flow objectives.
How does that fit in with some of the work that's been done on biological objectives?
Well, certainly, biological objectives in many cases, and perhaps John can talk about this in more detail. A lot of these are looking at the invertebrates in the sediment of the streams, and then developing a rating for the stream. And so certainly when we see healthy invertebrate populations, generally there's, the reason for that is that there's adequate flows in the system to sustain them. So as part of our overall look at our priorities and the flows necessary, we'll be looking at that information as well. I don't know if John had anything else to add.
No, except that when they do the assessment, they also do look at some of the conditions in the stream, so you can get some information about flow associated with it. It's not a flow criteria, but it's information about the flow when they were out there.
So the only other thing that, just final comment, as far as, one of the things that I think was pretty compelling is the desire by a lot of the commenters to be able to help direct funding to these areas of priority. And I think that this report can probably serve a similar purpose.
Can I build on something Tom
Sure.
touched on?
And then Tam, it's after you.
Thank you, I appreciate it. You can have the last word. No, I just thank you, Tom, for that comprehensive overview of a lot of the work we're doing. One thing I just wanted to see if you wanted to comment on sort of the last piece that might relate to this hearing, which is, once you've established a scientifically defensible flow criterion or objective. For instance, let's take your North Fork of the Feather. You've got a number now, bypass flow. The next step would be augmenting the listing policy with some sort of algorithm methodology that's transparent, where you take the data set of flow and then you apply it against a criterion like the North Fork of the Feather minimum flow at this time of the year. What would we need to do to kind of close the loop, with that work that we're doing in these different watersheds, to being able to make a decision on a impairment or evaluation of water quality?
Sure. And I think that in many cases the staff was a little unsure of how to proceed because there wasn't the sort of clear lines of what the board had considered to be, the board had developed as, the criteria for which impairment would be judged. And especially with respect to flow, where in order to have a flow objective that makes, that's usable, it has to be one that tries to balance all the uses to some extent, since, of course, we need to use some of the flow. You could say we need to impair the flow in order to ensure economic development and sustainability of our population. And so, but clearly, over time, as we develop a more robust program in this regard, and we start having large numbers of water bodies for which we have flow objectives, the clear approach would be to compare the flow objective to, which we're actually seeing in the watershed, and if it isn't being met, to identify that as one that needs to have some work done on it through further water right proceedings, presumably. And whether we put that into a 305B listing or a 303D or whatever, I leave that to the board.
You should never let me have the last word, because I think I'm going to derail this entire discussion. Well, no, okay, and I'll apologize to the speakers who are waiting to speak, but as I'm listening to this discussion, it just occurs to me how bureaucratic it sounds. As someone who, worked for you, Mr. Howard, in the early 1990s, when we, and to this day, are still struggling to look at setting flows in the Delta, and given all the resources, the attention, the time and energy, the science that's been, been placed into that effort, waiting for the development of defensible flow objectives, that integrating a mechanism into the flow listing policy, and I won't even ask Ms. Sheehan to come up and remind us how long that took, the first go around, in order for us to take some action. Sounds too long for me to hold my breath. And I recognize that, there are many challenges that we have to deal with. There are the juggling of issues. There's the issue about data and uncertainty. There's the issue of regional water boards getting involved in flow. I mean, all of that. But in everything that we do, I would hope that we try to approach it from a practical as well as a triage kind of method. I would hope that when we consider flows, let me try an analogy. The way that you're describing this to me, and I just thought of this, so it may not come off, really well, but it's like my developing a monthly budget to determine how much of my money would go towards, the mortgage, how much towards food, how much towards entertainment, when my bank account is zero. And so if your bank account is already zero, what's the point of setting up a budget to determine how much money you'll need if your bank account is already at zero? So I think, in a way, I guess I'm starting to be much more sympathetic now to the NGOs who are saying, we have streams and water bodies that are at critical condition. Isn't there a way for us to sort of, we talked about visual assessment yesterday when looking at trash. I mean, there's got to be a multi-pronged approach towards identifying and prioritizing streams rather than just the one-size-fit-all. We must develop a defensible flow objective, because there are a lot of attorneys involved in this, before we can even start looking at flows. So I guess I actually am derailing the conversation, but I think it's an important conversation to have, because Mr. Howell, you say that staff is uncertain about going ahead without some clear direction from the board with respect to how a flow listing process might look like, and I doubt if we'll be able to reach any sort of consensus today, but I want to at least tee it up by voicing my concern, having been involved in flow process much longer than I care to relate. Sitting around and waiting for the data, the funding to develop defensible flow objectives seems to me not a very effective way to proceed. It may be a legally defensible or a legally conservative way to approach, but is it going to be the most effective way? Looking at what we've not been able to achieve in the Delta, given all of the resources and data that has gone into flow objective setting there, I'm at a loss as to what is that quote about insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
Did you want a response to
Yes, I do.
Well, it seems as though you're suggesting I'm advocating.
Are you insane, Mr. Howell? You can respond to that, yes.
It seems as though the impression is I'm advocating that the only way, or that your impression seems to be that what I'm saying is the only way to decide whether or not something is flow impaired is whether a water quality objective has been established for it. And of course, that's not true. I am a firm believer that almost every water body in the state is flow impaired. I think that that's deliberate, that we impair flows in order to ensure economic development. And so, it's an easy thing to list water bodies for flow impairment. I think that with the exception of just one or two water bodies of the state, they are impaired for flow. And I think there's plenty of evidence to support that. But this question is a policy question for the board. It's not a physical question for the board. And the policy question is, do we want to be stating the obvious and saying that water bodies are flow impaired? If we want to do that, then I would suggest you put it on 305B, because I don't think we want to be doing TMDLs for it. I think we want to be doing what we're doing now. But I don't also think that it really serves a great deal of purpose. I mean, obviously, if you're listing most everything, you're not really getting much information. And for setting priorities, I think because we have to accept that these impairments exist everywhere, that really priorities need to be set by our perception of our likelihood of success in setting flow objectives, the value of that particular water body to the resource compared to other water bodies. Because if we, since they're basically all impaired, they all need to have flow objectives established for them. And, the issue, like I say, before the board is not whether or not we can figure out easily how to establish some method of saying they're impaired. Weight of evidence is fine. It's really a policy question the board has to grapple with, not a physical question.
And if I might, the approach that you just stated, presumably that was already done in the 2010 report, since it is according to priority. Maybe not within each category, but there are three different priorities listed.
Yeah, and I would say that the work we're trying to do now, the 5 tributaries that we identified with Fish and Wildlife and through the Governor's Action Plan, the 3 tributaries that we established, these emergency flows for the Delta, the work we are doing is based on the impaired water bodies that we think are the highest priority right now. And we're dedicating our resources to that. Listing more water bodies isn't going to change what we dedicate our resources to. Personally, I'm fully dedicated to the idea of setting flow objectives, and I've been moving resources around to accomplish that, and I will continue to do that because I think the need is so large and it's been an ongoing demand for a long time.
Let me toss one question back at you. The value of doing flow objectives will be the follow-up action as a result of those flow objectives, meaning, I mean, it was just everything we do. Setting a standard, setting an objective is meaningless unless we then pursue actions. And those actions, presumably, are to achieve those objectives and protect and provide for those beneficial uses. So, and at some point we have to get to the other speakers. So if there is evidence to show that a stream indeed has no water and therefore no flow and therefore the beneficial uses are not being protected, couldn't we just shortcut all of that and not wait to develop the flow objectives when it's, I guess I'm trying to make Ms. Sheehan's argument for her, which I really shouldn't because she is so effective on her own right. So I guess my question again is why wait?
Well, I've actually asked the question in the past, why not establish for all blue line USGS streams in the state a water quality objective that says a live stream is required? In other words, we know they need to have some water. Is there some policy the board could adopt that would say, oh, yeah, all blue line streams, they need to be live streams? Why wait?
We adopted a policy yesterday about no trash.
Why wait? Yeah.
I think water bodies should have water in them.
So the board could do that. The problem is, as you say, it's one thing to adopt a policy. The implementation is the key, and the method for implementing these things from the board's perspective is the water right process. And so, if we went through a water right process solely to get live streams, we'd still be going through a subsequent water right process to get appropriate flow objectives. But it's just that it's the water right process and what that entails, as you know what that process means, that stops us from saying, oh, well, why don't we just say everyone has to have a live stream?
So, Ms. Sheehan, could you please go fix the water rights process? Board.
We are being webcasted.
Linda Sheehan with Earth Law Center. Thank you for your question. I think that the folks following me will probably have much more knowledgeable responses with regard to the specifics. But of course, there are things in addition to the water rights process, right? There's illegal diversions, which could be acted on in a prioritized way if a water body is being overdiverted. And of course, then there's groundwater extraction. That is a huge problem for some of these waterways, which could take a different turn as well. So it's not just sort of solely one or the other. I think there's a suite of opportunities, and in this idea that the objective is flow objectives, the objective, as you say, is flow. The objective is that fish can swim. And so if we kind of focus on that as the goal, there's a suite of opportunities depending on the issue that we're talking about. And for those top priority ones, I think we can look at these in a more holistic way. I think there's a lot of opportunity.
Okay, let's move on. Chris, sorry. And followed by Conrad and Tim, Nathaniel, Susan, Ben, Sarah, and Sarah. Okay.
Hi, my name is Chris Mahlon. I'm the chair of the North Coast Streamflow Coalition. And just bouncing off Mr. Howard here, he kind of stole the thunder out of our comments here, but I think that he made the case for 303D listing because we do want water in the streams, and water rights, they say that you must protect the public trust in every single water right. You have to protect the public trust. If a water right's hurting the public trust, then there's a problem there. So our coalition is comprised of 17 grassroots organizations based from the Oregon border to San Francisco Bay and including the Klamath River Basin. Those organizations, along with 34,000 members, are working to protect and restore stream flow in the face of a progressive and unrelenting stream dewatering. In spite of our best efforts, we are losing. Each year, key salmon streams are dry for longer and longer periods, and in spite of public trust complaints by our members and others, the progressive dewatering continues to unabated. We are losing our streams, and that is why we need your help today. You can help us right now by relying on the definitive information provided by many of the groups here today throughout the North Coast to list those streams with where their beneficial uses have clearly been damaged and degraded as a result of excessive stream diversion and unregulated groundwater extraction. To help us now when we so desperately need your help, you will need to reject your staff's reasons for not supporting flow-impaired listings. And as Mr. Howard already said, that he will and is working on a assessment for methodology for determining flows. So if that is actually coming out this summer, and these TMDL listings won't be implemented until 2017, why aren't we like combining this and making it happen to get the listing? Because he's essentially saying, let's list. And yes, it will help us to list
He's
303D.
saying, let's put in stream flows. That's different from listing. Listing sometimes, but rarely, in my experience, results in actual more water.
Right, but the staff are saying that they can't deal with the 303D listing to determine flows case by case on streams unless they have a well-developed stream methodology. So if he's working on a methodology, and obviously the governor has determined certain streams need to have flow augmentation, and it seems to me we already have the science there, and we just need to get these listings, because you can't do it by yourself, Mr. Howard and board. You cannot put the water back in the streams by yourself. You need us who live out there on the streams, we who go to city council meetings and board of supervisors meetings on projects. We need those listings. Help us. They help us, protect the streams. So if we get the 303D listing, then we, the public, can help revive our streams and help us go forward through drought conditions, climate change, and everything that's coming at us. So it's progressive, it's futuristic, it's what we need to do. And I think you just had that discussion just now, Mr. Howard, and thank you, Tam Doduk, for your comments. They were exceptional. We appreciate them.
Thank
As you
you.
well know, we are in the 4th year of drought because the governor and this board have failed to require cutbacks in agricultural water use, which is 80% of all California water use. Our streams and salmon rivers will be dry or have meager and inadequate flows longer this year than in any other year on record. Under these conditions, the need for action should trump the staff's reticence and preference for the most cautious approach conceivable. Please recognize that the CO do not have the luxury of the most cautious approach. Give us the flow TMDL impairment listing we need now to defend our public trust rights to fish, swim, and recreate in wild streams where the survival of salmon are key to our existence. Thank you so much.
Conrad Fisher, Klamath River Keeper. I just want to thank the board for your questions. I could not have asked better questions. I wanted to clap, but I thought that might be inappropriate, but thank you. I think we're getting to the crux of the issue here, and one of the primary excuses against using the Clean Water Act to restore flows was we don't have a methodology. I think the fundamental issues with not using the Clean Water Act to restore flows are the same fundamental issues that have prevented using the public trust doctrine, reasonable use doctrine, ESA, or all the other laws at our disposal. It's that we cannot agree how much water fish need. I think we are forging new ground, coming up with public trust flows and maybe having a regional approach to assessing how much water fish need, and I think that's very good. But we need to recognize we already have flows assessed on the Scott and the Shasta rivers. We already know that zero water is not enough on smaller tributaries to the Klamath. We need to ask ourselves, why aren't those studies enough? So I would argue, let's maybe State Water Board and Cal Fish and Wildlife get in a room and don't come out until you agree what is the scientific methodology that will satisfy all the laws that we have at our disposal and be scientifically defensible and legally defensible. Because we have spent so much taxpayer money going down the roads of determining how much water fish need and then starting over from scratch. So part of what Tom is suggesting is that we start over on some of these rivers that already have quantified flow recommendations. I would also ask the Water Board, ask your staff, show us the water. Show us the water. Where have enforcement actions actually led to water? And they're going to list off Mill, Deer, and Antelope Creek, and only one of those was an actual enforcement action. The others were voluntary. So what is preventing enforcement actions? With the California Water Bond and the action plan and implementations of the water bond, we're going to hear more and more about voluntary transactions, which are fine and dandy, but there will never be enough money in the world to buy all the water we need for fish. So let's not give up on enforcement actions. So the barriers to Clean Water Act listing are the same as the barriers to everything else, and it's science and to some extent political will. So I think you've asked the right questions to address that. Couple more concrete recommendations. The next round of curtailment letters, and I'm sure they will come, include mentioning your existing authority under the public trust doctrine and actually maybe curtail to the extent that you can meet public trust flows. The last round the governor did were intended solely to mitigate between off-stream water users, and that was not enough. Let's really look hard at this regional percent of flow scientific methodology that was talked about at the regional board. I've been saying that for years, but not as a scientist. I kind of get laughed out of the room, but we need something across the board. Eventually, all of California should be covered by recommendations that we all can agree on. And to the extent we're going to go down the road of voluntary transactions, we could do a lot by just attaching strings to water conserved with public money. If people shouldn't be able to get it unless they agree to give it back to nature. So, yeah, thanks.
On Tim. You know you're next.
Good afternoon. My name is Tim Sloan. I'm with the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations. Zeke Grader regrets that he can't be here today, but he sent me. I hope you'll follow me on a little analogy. When a drug addict is so damaged their well-being as to necessitate the interference of their friends and family, those loved ones will often stage an intervention. At such a proceeding, the addict is forced to come face-to-face with the effects of their addiction. The hope is that the head-on collision of the addict with the consequences of his addiction will force that addict to recognize, perhaps for the first time, that there is a problem. Without recognition, there can be no recovery. We're inviting the State Board to come to terms with the vital fact that California has a problem. Our streams are being dewatered at an alarming rate. The current levels of dangerously low flows are not aberrations caused by drought. Diversions in wells serving private interests reduce flows to dangerously low levels even during wet years. The negative effects of dewatering are patent: increased pollutant concentration, temperature increase, habitat loss, and the potential extinction of threatened and endangered salmonids. We're inviting you to join the fight to prevent these potentially lethal implications. The listing process is the hydrological equivalent of the addict's admission that he has a problem and requires help. It's the first crucial step in the road to recovering beneficial uses, including the achievement of viable and productive populations of anadromous fish. We urge the board to impose flow impairment listings immediately as to begin the recovery process while these waterways still exist. We are well aware that this is a time of unprecedented stress on California's water supply. That stress, however, does not relieve the Water Board of its obligation under the Clean Water Act to list water bodies where designated beneficial uses are impaired. PCFFA respectfully urges the board to lockstep with its counterparts in Washington, Wyoming, several other states, and to follow the recommendations of its staff to admit that flow impairments to California waterways have devastating effects on dependent ecosystems. It is time to start our road to recovery. Thank you.
Board members, if I could also interject, I'm hearing numerous instances of listing on 303D for flow impairments, and indeed the first step and the only step for listing on 303D are when impairments are identified by pollutants for which a TMDL is required. That's the 303D list, that's category 5, and that directs the states to prioritize which segments need the development of a TMDL. Looking at the entire integrated report that we categorize in categories 1 through 5, even looking at category 4C, which does allow for placement of pollution impairments, category 4, the umbrella for 4C, so we're looking at category 4A, 4B, and 4C. The umbrella for category 4 is a TMDL is not required. And so 4A, for instance, says all the beneficial uses are no longer impaired and no TMDL is needed. 4B indicates, yeah, thank you for correcting me. 4A is a TMDL is in place.